Historians have written about the events and people of the end of the 18th century that the American and French revolutions opened up an era of glory seekers. But among the dozens of famous princes and statesmen, generals and reformers of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, none could match the two rulers of human destinies, Emperor Alexander I of Russia and Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte of France. The gripping dramatic contest between the two giants determined the history of the 19th century. By the 2nd of December 1805, Napoleon had concentrated about 50,000 men near the small Czech town of Austerlitz, close to the fortress of Brno. The army corps of Marshal Lannes stood on his left flank. Marshal Bernadotte's corps and Marshal Murat's reserve cavalry were covered by the Garde Impériale in the center, while the army corps under Marshal Soult was deployed on the right. On the eve of the battle, the right flank of the Grande Armée was joined by Marshal Davout's corps, so that the strength of Napoleon's forces reached 73,000 men. Napoleon himself took a position behind his guard. The opposing Russo-Austrian army, commanded by Mikhail Kutuzov, numbered some 86,000 men, divided into several battle formations. General Bagration's column lined up on the right flank. The center of the position on Prazen Heights was occupied by General Kolovrat's column, supported by the Austrian troops of Field Marshal Lieutenant Liechtenstein, with the guards behind them. Emperors Alexander and Franz, with their suites, chose a site between Kolovrat's units and the guards. On the Russo-Austrian left, Marshal Davout's corps was faced with four columns under Field Marshal Lieutenant Kinmaier, Generals Doktorov, Langeron, and Przybyszewski. The overall command of them was entrusted to General Buxgevden. Kutuzov warned Alexander that he should not attempt a hasty offensive in order to allow time for reinforcements to ensure an overwhelming superiority. But the emperor, who was no expert in the art of war, ordered to advance. The plan of offensive was worked out by the Austrian Major General von Weyrother, who estimated Napoleon's troops at merely 30 or 40,000, and accordingly believed that the French emperor would be reduced to passive defense. According to the disposition, the main part of the Russo-Austrian army was to round Napoleon's right flank and cut off any possibility of retreat to Vienna. Napoleon brought his principal forces back behind Bosenitz Creek, thus creating an impression with the Allied command that he would avoid decisive action. At 7 a.m. on December the 2nd, Russo-Austrian columns moved forward. General Bagration's regiments, assisted by the cavalry of Field Marshal Lieutenant Liechtenstein, about 17,500 men, attacked in the direction of Brno. The columns of Generals Przybyszewski, Langeron, and Doktorov, aided by Kinmaier's detachment, in all nearly 42,000, under the supervision of General Buxgevden, had to accomplish an encircling maneuver and surround Napoleon's right flank. About 9 o'clock, Russians and Austrians stormed their way into the village of Telnitz, and at 11 into Sokolnitz. Meanwhile, on the left, the Allied columns were caught in an engagement with Marshal Davout's units. As soon as Kolovrat's column descended from Prasen Heights, Napoleon attacked it with Marshal Soult's corps and practically destroyed it. Getting rid of the Allied centre, Napoleon struck against the rear of General Buxgevden's troops who were pressing Davout's position. Przybyszewski's column was crushed, and part of it surrendered, while the remains of Buxgevden's men were thrown back toward Lake Zachan. Russians and Austrians tried to cross its frozen surface, but the ice being too thin, some 2,000 soldiers perished. While battle raged on the Allied left and centre, the corps of Marshal Lannes and Murat's cavalry reserves rebuffed the detachment led by Bagration. In all, the Allies lost some 27,000 killed, wounded and captured at Austerlitz, and about 12,000 were left on the field by the Grande Armée. The Battle of Preussisch Eylay, which took place on the 27th of January 1807, was one of the hottest actions of the Napoleonic campaigns. On the eve of the engagement, Cavalry General Leonty Bennigsen, Commander-in-Chief of the Russo-Prussian forces, had to retreat hastily since Napoleon strove to cut off his communications with Russia. The retreating maneuver ended near the little town of Preussisch Eylau, where a decisive clash had to be fought out. Prior to the battle, the French managed to seize Preussisch Eylau. Bennigsen's army moved away from the town and encamped between the villages of Schloditten and Serpalen, protecting the roads to Russia and to Königsberg, residence of King Frederick William III of Prussia and his court. The right flank, under Lieutenant General Tuchkov, consisted of the 5th and 7th Infantry Divisions. The centre, commanded by Lieutenant General Osten-Sacken, comprised the 3rd and 8th Infantry Divisions, and the left was defended by the 2nd Infantry Division of Lieutenant General Osterman Tolstoy. The 4th and 14th Infantry Divisions, along with Lieutenant General Golitsyn's cavalry, formed the reserve. The artillery was divided into 3 strong batteries, 60 guns on the right, 70 in the centre, and 40 on the left. Besides, several companies of horse artillery stood in reserve. Before the battle, Bennigsen ordered the Prussian corps of General Lestock to join his main forces. All told, the numbers of the Russo-Prussian army reached 72,000 men. On the morning of the 27th of January 1807, at the sound of the first cannon blasts, Napoleon started to deploy his army into combat order. The 4th Army Corps under Soult on the left flank was positioned along the outskirts of Eylau and to the north of it. The centre was taken by the Imperial Guard and the adjoining 7th Corps under Augereau, behind which stood Murat's reserve cavalry. Davout's 3rd Army Corps, expected to appear any minute, had to round the left flank of the Russo-Prussian army. The strength of the Grande Armée, including Davout's troops, also amounted to 72,000. The assault of Augereau's corps against the Allied centre, as the French Emperor intended, would have made Bennigsen employ the bulk of his reserves to thwart it. Between 8 and 9 in the morning, the French Third Corps, recently arrived on the field, began to spread out its regiments. To give Davout time to complete his maneuver, Napoleon ordered Augereau's columns to advance. The skies were now clearing up, now darkening with clouds. Snow began to fall, reducing visibility to 50 or 100 paces at most. Bennigsen resorted to a tactical ruse, putting his cannon in position just before dawn so that the French could not determine the whereabouts of his batteries. As soon as the battalions of the 7th Corps, shrouded by the blizzard, approached the Russian front line, they were suddenly met by grapeshot from 70 cannon. A devastating fire upset the dense columns of French infantry. When the cannonade subsided, the Russian center counterattacked with bayonets and literally wiped out the remains of the 7th Corps. At the same time, Davout's charge on Serpollen was frustrated. To save the day, about 10 a.m., Napoleon ordered Marshal Murat, with his reserve cavalry, assisted by the horse guards of Marshal Bessières, to stop the advancing Russians. In this encounter, both sides suffered immense losses. Augereau's corps and Murat's cavalry were so depleted that they could not take an active part in further movements of the Grande Armée. Nevertheless, Napoleon did succeed in his main objective. Bennigsen transferred many detachments from his left flank, thus facilitating Davout's offensive around it. While a furious battle raged in the center, Marshal Davout's troops at last managed to enter the village of Serpollen, which was set ablaze before the Russians withdrew. The Marshal was now within sight of the Kregov Heights, the key not just to the left flank of Bennigsen's army, but to the entire Russian position. The heights were occupied by the 14th Infantry Division of Major General Kamensky. In vain, the French Third Corps assailed Kregov Heights and the village of Klein Sausgarten until 3 o'clock. About that time, there appeared another French division of the Third Corps, led by General Goudin, who did not participate in the action until then. Reinforced by that division, Davout's corps eventually took the village and the heights. By and by, Russian units were thrown back behind the Auklappen-Kushiten line. But at this point, 3 companies of horse artillery arrived from the right flank. The newly formed 36-gun battery aimed at and set fire to the hamlet of Auklappen, after which Russian infantry counterattacked and won it back. About 5 o'clock, Lestock's corps also entered the scene. After a valiant charge, Russians and Prussians recaptured Kushiten from the French. After that, Davout's regiments fell back on Klein Sausgarten, and the battle began to die away. By 9 in the evening, the cannonade had ceased. The outcome of the battle near Preussisch Eylay proved very unsatisfactory for Napoleon. He not only failed to defeat Bennigsen's army, as he planned, but also incurred huge losses, nearly 29,000 killed or wounded. The Russians lost some 26,000. Eylay marked the end of the period of dazzling Napoleonic victories. The very triumphs that the French Emperor achieved led to unforeseen results, for his enemies gradually learned to fight against him. The 7th of September, 1812, seemed to be the fulfillment of Napoleon's dream. Here was the crucial pitched battle with the Russian army which he had desired ever since the early days of the campaign. Kutuzov realized that his adversary would launch a fierce assault on the Russian forces. To check the offensive impact of the Grande Armée, he chose a position on the field of Borodino, traversed by countless ravines, riverbeds and creeks, and covered by trees and shrubs. These local obstacles could somewhat restrain Napoleon's maneuvers, forcing him to make direct attacks with heavy casualties. The Russian army's right flank, protected by the steep banks of the river Koloch, was practically unassailable to the French. Here, Kutuzov deployed 2 infantry corps, under the overall command of General Miloradovich, as well as the 1st Reserve Cavalry Corps of Lieutenant General Uvarov and Ataman Platov's Cossacks. The center was defended by the 6th Infantry Corps of General Dokhturov and the 3rd Cavalry Corps under Lieutenant General Palin. The supreme command of the right flank and center went to the head of the 1st Western Army, Infantry General Barclay de Tolly. The 5th Infantry Corps of Lieutenant General Lavrov and the 1st Cuirassier Division of Major General Borozdin II stood in reserve behind the village of Knyazkovo. The left flank comprised the regiments of the 2nd Western Army, commanded by General Prince Bagration. Lieutenant General Rayevsky's 7th Infantry Corps and Major General Siever's 4th Cavalry Corps were arrayed between Kurganaya Hill and Semyonovskaya village. A redoubt, armed with a 12-gun battery, was built on Kurganaya Hill, which rose in the middle of Russian battle lines. Behind the Semyonovsky ravine, near the edge of the Utitsa forest, 2 lunettes and a flèche were constructed to reinforce the front line of the Russian left flank. The flèche had 24 cannon. These outworks were defended by the 2nd Combined Grenadier Division under Major General Count Vorontsov. The 8th Infantry Corps of Lieutenant General Borozdin I and the 2nd Cuirassier Division of Major General Duka were placed behind the flèche. The 3rd Infantry Corps of Lieutenant General Tuchkov I blocked the old Smolensk road near the village of Utitsa and acted as a separate military unit. All in all, regular Russian troops on the Borodino field numbered around 120,000 men and 636 artillery pieces. Napoleon was in no hurry to spread the Grande Armée out for combat. For the whole day on the 6th of September, he thoroughly examined Russian positions and realized that their right flank was virtually secure. He could only attack Kutuzov's army in the center or the left. The Emperor deliberately took a long time to deploy his divisions. To the very last, he wanted the Russian commander to wonder whether he would charge the defenders or go round them. Uncertain of Napoleon's intentions, Kutuzov had to keep numerous detachments on his right instead of using them to reinforce Bagration's army. The night of the 7th of September arrived before the main forces of the Grande Armée started their march towards the Russian left. When the morning mist cleared, Bagration and his staff officers saw the terrible masses of the French divisions getting ready to attack the flèche. To upset Bagration, Napoleon advanced the 1st Army Corps of Marshal Davout, the 3rd Army Corps of Marshal Ney, the 8th Army Corps of Division General Junot, and 3 Reserve Cavalry Corps, commanded by Marshal Murat. At this very point, Napoleon decided to break the Russian defense and to deal a crushing blow. The 5th Army Corps of General Prince Poniatowski was expected to round the Russian left along the old Smolensk road, although Napoleon did not know that the Poles were anticipated there by Tuchkov's infantry. The 4th Army Corps, under Eugene Beauharnais, Viceroy of Italy, had to charge the Russian center. On his left flank, the Emperor of France left a negligible number of troops in the belief that nothing threatened him there. The Emperor's forces at Borodino amounted to nearly 135,000 men and 587 guns. At 6 in the morning, Marshal Davout's regiments struck against the Fleches. However, the assaults of crack French infantry were thwarted by the fierce resistance of Vorontsov's grenadiers. 2 of Davout's division generals, Pompin and Dessay, were wounded, while the Marshal himself suffered a contusion. The fearless Ney rushed to assist the 1st Army Corps. Bagration made use of his grenadier and cuirassier reserves. At 8 o'clock, Napoleon ordered Beauharnais to storm the Great Redoubt, as the battery on top of Kurganaya Hill was called by the French. About 8:30, the 14th Infantry Division of General Broussier from the 4th Army Corps, along with the 1st and 3rd Infantry Divisions of the 1st Army Corps assigned to Beauharnais during the battle, fought their way through dense bushes to the bottom of Kurganaya Hill under the bullets of Russian chasseurs. After cruel hand-to-hand combat, the French 30th Infantry Regiment under Brigadier General Bonamy made it into the Great Redoubt. But a Russian counterattack, launched by the 12th and 26th Infantry Divisions and headed by Major General Yermolov, Chief of Staff of the 1st Western Army, resulted in the almost complete destruction of the 30th Regiment, while Bonamy was taken prisoner. At the height of the battle, Prince Pyotr Bagration was gravely wounded and yielded command to Infantry General Doktorov. The Russians abandoned the Fleches by then piled up with corpses and held out on the other side of the Semyonovsky ravine, showering the French from their powerful reserve artillery. Kutuzov sent the Litovsky, Izmailovsky, and Finlandsky guards to relieve his left flank. About 12 o'clock, the French attempted a new attack against the Russian left. Davout sent General Friant's 2nd Infantry Division, not involved in the battle as yet, to capture Semyonovskaya village. The 1st Reserve Cavalry Corps, under General Nansouty, clashed with the Russian Guards, while the 4th Reserve Cavalry Corps of General Latour-Maubourg tried to break the defensive line between the village and Kurganaya Hill. After some savage fighting, French attacks were repulsed, and Friant's voltigeurs only managed to capture the ruins of Semyonovskaya. Meanwhile, Platov's Cossacks and Uvarov's 1st Cavalry Corps moved against the left flank of the Grande Armée. Taken aback by this maneuver, Napoleon rejected the request of French marshals to bring his Imperial Guard into action. As the enemy's attention was diverted by the Russian cavalry raid, Kutuzov strengthened his center by sending there from the right the 4th Infantry Corps under Osterman Tolstoy. About 2 in the afternoon, Napoleon ordered another assault on Kurganaya Hill. The 2nd Reserve Cavalry Corps, led by General Caulaincourt, who took over after General Montbrun's death, finally stormed the hill and seized it, but Caulaincourt also perished in this bloody action. Despite this success, Napoleon failed to break the Russian front. Barclay de Tolly withdrew a mere 800 meters from Kurganaya Hill, regrouped his forces, and rebuffed the last charges of the Grande Armée. By 5 o'clock, active fighting had subsided, although the cannonade went on until 8 in the evening. Both sides suffered enormous casualties at the Battle of Borodino. The Russians had almost 44,000 killed and wounded, while Napoleon lost about 30,000 men. The principal outcome was that Napoleon did not achieve a decisive victory over the Russian army, which meant that there was little hope of ending the war. By the 16th of October, 1813, Napoleon's main forces were assembled near Leipzig. The French Emperor had at his disposal between 155 and 175,000 men and 717 cannon. He was threatened on all sides by 4 Allied armies, whose overall strength was 306,000 with 1,385 guns. It seemed sheer madness to fight the adversary against such odds. However, Napoleon could well remember how in recent years he managed to conquer his numerous enemies one by one, not giving them a chance to join forces. He hoped that at Leipzig, fate would once again favor his usual strategy. On the 16th of October, only one of the 4 Allied armies reached the battlefield of Leipzig. This was the Bohemian army led by von Schwarzenberg, 134,000 Austrians, Russians and Prussians. The three monarchs who headed the anti-French coalition, Alexander I, Franz I and Frederick William III, also arrived with it. The staff of the Bohemian army planned to hold out until the expected arrival of the Silesian army under Blücher, 60,000 Russians and Prussians. The other two forces, Bernadotte's Northern Army, 58,000 Russians, Prussians and Swedes, and Bennigsen's Polish Army, 54,000 Russians and Prussians, were due to finish their march on Leipzig on the 17th of October. Napoleon thus did not have at least 24 hours to go, but the great commander never lost his hope of success. He decided to aim a heavy blow with his forces against the position of the Bohemian army and to vanquish it before other allies came. On the other hand, the Allied staff resolved to attack Leipzig from the south, not waiting for the approaching armies. The main thrust had to be dealt by 84,000 troops under Barclay de Tolly. Even earlier, at 2 p.m., Blücher's Silesian army struck against the corps of Marshal Marmont at Mechern and seized that fortified town after a hot engagement. The French Emperor's plan to defeat the Allies one by one was not destined to come true. On the morning of the 16th of October, Barclay's soldiers began to advance in pouring rain. The village of Wachau was contested in fierce combat, and the French managed to stay there. Napoleon thought that the crucial point of the battle had come. About 3 in the afternoon, Division General Drouot showered the Allied centre with the fire of 160 cannon. After this squall of gunfire, Marshal Murat charged with his 2 cavalry corps, some 10,000 swords. The Allied centre was broken. Murat's cuirassiers trampled the ranks of enemy infantry at the village of Gossas and rushed to a hill near Maisdorf, where the Allied monarchs stood with their staff. Emperor Alexander of Russia reacted instantly. Obeying his orders to fill the gap, the 100-gun battery of General Sukhavoy-Zanit, Palin's horsemen, and Raevski's grenadiers hurried to the rescue. Murat's gallant attack was repelled. At 5 in the evening, Napoleon still refused to admit failure. He considered another attack on the center of the Bohemian army, throwing in action his Imperial Guard. But just then, an Austrian corps, under General Merfeld, engaged the right flank of the French army, defended by Marshal Poniatowski. The marshal had to be helped out. The Austrians were beaten, and Merfeld was taken prisoner, but the moment for a new action against the Allied centre was irretrievably lost. On the 17th of October, the opponents were content with half-hearted fire. Napoleon was not strong enough for another effort, while Alexander and his regal companions happily greeted the columns of the northern and Polish armies, fatigued by their march. That day, the entire Allied army finally got together on the field near Leipzig. Having realized the situation, Napoleon sent the captured General Merfeld to Emperor Franz I of Austria with a peace proposal. But he waited in vain for any answer, and only lost time when he could retreat without heavy losses. The monarchs were not in the mood to negotiate with Napoleon. On the 18th of October, the Allied powers tenaciously attacked French entrenchments, though almost all the morning attempts were beaten back. But at 2 p.m., Bernadotte's northern army dealt a crushing blow to the corps of Division General Régnier. Part of that Saxonian corps changed sides and joined the Allies. At the same time, the Silesian, Reserve, and Bohemian armies rushed into battle again. As a result, Napoleon's troops fell back to the walls of Leipzig. The French emperor now had no option but to retreat. On the night of the 19th of October, Napoleon began to evacuate his men from Leipzig across the Elster River. But he was unable to secure an organized retreat. The Allied regiment stormed into the city and made for the only stone bridge over the Elster. Seeing Russian uniforms close by, French sappers blew up the bridge. Nearly 30,000 Frenchmen under Marshals MacDonald and Poniatowski were cut off from the rest of their army. Many tried to swim across the river, which MacDonald managed to do, but Poniatowski lost his life. During the bloody action at Leipzig, known as the Battle of Nations, the French lost about 65,000 men, and the Allies nearly 54,000. The power of the Corsican robber was finally broken on the field of Leipzig. He could not now raise several 100,000 soldiers to shield his lovely France from the terrible invasion of the Allied armies.